Welcome to News from Neptune for August 30th in the 35th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says, "Terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism." That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that call themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says that the U.S. media either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a What the 2020 Election is About edition of News from Neptune. The Democrat Party thinks it can win the 2020 presidential election, no matter how ridiculous its presidential candidates are. Have you heard Joe Biden recently? By demonizing President Trump and running against him as a racist. He's certainly giving them plenty of help. But what the Democrats are desperate to have triumph are the new neoliberal and neoconservative policies that have characterized all administrations for 40 years. More war and more war provocations versus Russia and China, to retard the economic integration of Eurasia, a threat to the world economic domination of the U.S. 1%. But of course, the Democrats can't admit that that's their goal. Well, the Republicans can, probably. So they lie about hope and change while continuing neolib and neocon policies. We'll begin with a brief note on really a retraction almost, I think, David.
Yeah. Okay.
And regarding Tulsi Gabbard,
Oh, no.
this is a bone of contention between me and our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, but I think he's won the argument, and I have to admit it.
Too bad.
A CBS interviewer asked Tulsi Gabbard, quote, "Earlier this month, you told our political reporter that you would support the Democratic nominee if you end up winning the primary, if you end up not winning the primary. Is there any policy a Democratic nominee could hold that would persuade you not to elect them in the general election?" We expect Gabbard, who's been the only anti-war voice amongst these munchkins who are running for the Democratic nomination, we would expect, apparently a reporter expect, for Gabbard to say something anti-war, something against the 8 wars President Obama conducted, the ongoing wars that the present administration has inherited from the last one, etc. Instead, she said, "No. I am, as are all the other candidates that I'm aware of running for president, committed to defeating Donald Trump in 2020. I look forward and hope to be able to earn that nomination myself, but if not, then I'll join the others in making sure that happens," defeat of Trump. The reporter, CBS reporter, says to Gabbard, "Will you ultimately support the Democratic nominee?" The suppressed premise is regardless of who it is. Gabbard answers, "Yes." Our researcher, who has never shared my enthusiasm for Gabbard as the only apparent anti-war candidate in this group, sends a comment from the late political philosopher B.B. King. The thrill is gone, the thrill is gone away, the thrill is gone, baby, the thrill is gone away. You know you done me wrong, baby, and you'll be sorry someday. Seems to me to be the best comment on Gabbard's anti-war position. Jeff writes, so this is what it took, eh? I can't say the thrill is gone for me, as I never had that thrill to start with, and you can't lose what you never had. As you might have guessed, I looked on her candidacy as the latest in a line of Democratic Party shepherds, nothing more. Ultimately, it's the neoliberal, neoconservative nature of that party that turned me off to all of its candidates, no matter how critical their speech occasionally became. I was mildly entertained to see her candidacy roll along, to watch other people's reactions to things she said, and to notice what they chose not to pay much attention to, such as Gabbard's interviews that got far too little review, like her 2018 Intercept interview and her Primo Nutmeg interview, it's true, where she stands by the same pro-war views. To me, it's all part, Jeff continues, to me, it's all part of the reason the largest segment of registered U.S. voters chose to stay home, as they say, and not vote for U.S. president at all. The range of allowable debate the major parties will tolerate is so narrow and basically all structured to benefit the elites that it's not worth the effort of picking one of the major party candidates over the other. Most people don't research third-party and independent candidates, so it's silly not to. Close quote from a researcher. So, for the moment at least, I have to admit defeat. There is no anti-war candidate amongst the Democrats, nor the Republicans, although peculiar things are going on occasionally amongst the Republicans, which I'll come to later today. But so long, Tulsi. It was nice knowing you. What's on your agenda, David?
As you know, I had a letter to the editor in the News Gazette yesterday, which I had discussed previously on this program, and actually I think circulated even before that on the Peace List. And I have been sort of fascinated by the coverage of this local group, a few people, doesn't matter how many. I mean, it's as many people as are in most groups of this nature. Bend the Arc, which is a national organization. Again, they claim to have chapters in almost all the major cities and so forth. Bend the Arc takes its phrase from, I guess, Martin Luther King. I never really knew whether he took it from somewhere else, some sort of biblical reference, I'm not sure. But it was a nice phrase until the Zionists got hold of it. and now it's become kind of a joke because, and I think this relates to what you're talking about, because as I said in concluding my letter, which had to do with their sort of hypocritical stance in criticizing Donald Trump, and I want to understand more. What did Donald Trump do to upset these people so much? I don't really understand, to provoke 3 or 4 letters, a couple of articles covered by a couple of events covered by full articles in the News Gazette. I don't know what they've done to deserve all this coverage and to write all these letters, and what Donald Trump and Rodney Davis have done that they haven't already done, that they haven't been doing, that's upset all these people who are claiming that another Holocaust is on the table because of what Donald Trump said about Jews being loyal or disloyal. What did he say? What did he mean? What do you know?
But the supporters of the 2 women who were barred from going, the 2 congressmen
Omar and
barred
Tlaib,
from going
Tlaib,
to the West Bank, that their support, they and their supporters are, in Trump's words, disloyal It's an interesting notion because people ask disloyal to whom, but it seemed to be a conjunction of American and Israeli policy, which demanded loyalty.
But all of a sudden, it's like these people who certainly don't disown Zionism in any way, shape, or form, and who Ben the Ark, whose stated policy is to be the only, if I think I'm correctly paraphrasing their national website, saying that they are the only national progressive Jewish organization to focus solely on domestic affairs, meaning we don't want to have to make a statement about U.S. foreign policy, Israel, what's going on with Palestine, and so forth. I mean, that's a pretty big concession for them to make, but it's clear that they're wanting to avoid engaging that issue. Meanwhile, they're back to referring to the idea that even though it's well understood that American Jews should be loyal to the existence of the Jewish state, a state based on, let's say, religious ethnicity, not really religion to a certain extent, but in a broader sense, religious background, being born to a Jew, meaning being born to a Jewish mother, as the Jewish law goes. What is it that, as you like to say, Carl, has gotten their knickers in such a twist over Trump? It's saying that if you're voting Democrat, even though the Democrats are still just a Zionist, I mean, nobody takes it seriously that Democrats aren't going to, including Tulsi Gabbard, who's never really made much of a firm statement about Israel and Palestine, although she has made good statements about other things in the Middle East. So what is it? I mean, I just see them as wanting to kind of showboat this, and to sort of, as I said in my email yesterday, summarizing some of these things, have this kind of Jewish Zionist pity party among relatively privileged people, thinking that they're being picked on, and somehow there's a historical trend that is in no way, shape, or form part of the politics of what is going on. Trump supports Israel. So do they. I don't get it. I just one kind of interesting thing I noted in reading on the New York Times. They did a long article on Stephen Miller, who is the Rasputin of the Trump White House, the quote. I always put white nationalism in quotes because I don't take the idea that this is a real important thing as seriously as I think you're supposed to right now, and I want people to understand that I don't take it seriously as a genuine political force. It's somewhat of a rhetorical force, I guess. The New York Times, I think New York Times Magazine article about Stephen Miller, who is a Jewish man from Santa Monica, California, not far from where I'm from. I looked a little bit about his upbringing and background. It makes it clear that he's from a nice Jewish family, a nice professional Jewish family, who's become a quote-unquote white nationalist. It didn't mention this deep coverage of him and his life, didn't mention that he was Jewish, although it's obviously clear that Zionism is a part of his white nationalist background. So what I'm attempting to do in my letter and in other ways is to point out to some of my dear friends in the Ben the Ark community, none of whom I actually know, and I just don't understand how much chutzpah you have to feel so sorry for yourself, and to be such a blatant hypocrite as to being accusing Donald Trump of all these things, and they don't have a thing to say about what's going on in Gaza. They don't have a thing to say about what's going on in the West Bank. Norman Finkelstein recently referred to Israel as an alt-right country. There's a nice two-part interview that you can get on Norman Finkelstein's website, in which he says many interesting things, including that American Jews need to understand that Israel isn't really even Jewish anymore, in the sense that liberal American Jews like to think of themselves. This is how the Ben the Ark people like to think of themselves. It's as if all these people were born into the Warsaw Ghetto and survived the Holocaust and gave birth to Noam Chomsky and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King and had they just had this incredible Jewish. I like to refer to the Jewish legacy, to the particularly European and American Jewish legacy of social justice. This doesn't involve supporting Joe Biden. I don't think. I could go on and on.
But you know the facts.
But you know the facts, right?
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the events in the country this weekend that are twisted in various ways by our mainstream media. And it's worthwhile to pay attention to how that happens and what the twisting produces. Strange things are going on sort of under the surface in American news reporting that probably should be brought up. I refer particularly to an article that comes not from American mainstream media, but from its British cousin, The Independent, in Britain. And the first thing you have to say about the newspaper, The Independent, is that it's not independent in any way. It's quite dependent upon the media moguls and the same class, the same 1%, including both British and American hegemonic classes.
Was one of the Coburns at one time associated with that newspaper, or am I getting that wrong?
I don't think so,
okay.
Although you might be right.
Yeah.
We're talking about the sons of the late Claude Coburn, the independent journalist, a truly independent journalist of the pre-Second World War time. His son, Alexander Coburn, the late Alexander Coburn, was a friend of this ground, and we regret his passing every day because of the clarity and honesty of the things that he had to say. He would talk about this, the story that I'm looking at here right now from The Independent, but perhaps not the way that it's being talked about in this country. The article, and as I say, this is paralleled by less detailed accounts in American journals. The Trump administration is considering blocking $250 million in military assistance to Ukraine in the latest move that highlights the White House's preference for Russia. Now, wait a minute, This is The Independent in Britain parroting the Russiagate line, a line that is practically dead in the United States, but not entirely by any means. And it's worthwhile to reflect on where Russiagate, the notion that President Trump is an active or passive agent of Vladimir Putin, where that comes from and whose interests are served by that quite remarkable asseveration. The Trump administration is considering blocking $250 million in military assistance to Ukraine in the latest move that highlights the White House's preference for Russia. Now, this is a news article now, not editorial. It's viewing with alarm at the outrageousness of the Trump administration, considering the possibility of not passing on $250 million to the government of Ukraine. This caught my eye particularly because I've been involved in a long Facebook argument with friends from elsewhere.
Only one?
Well, this is the one that I have in mine.
Yeah.
It's an argument with friends of mine who are not part of the local discussion, see? But perfectly intelligent, perfectly well-informed, upper middle class liberals, who should know all about it. The most amazing things have come out of this debate, and it shows how effective the American propaganda continues to be at this sort of a lower level. All of these people in this debate take for granted that the U.S. was minding its own business, and the Obama administration is drumming its fingers on the table, and suddenly the vicious Russians threatened to seize Ukraine and did manage to seize Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, according to this account, and won't give it back. And that this totally unlooked for attack caught the Obama administration by surprise, and this is so far from the facts. This is so far from the truth, taken for granted, as I say, by my interlocutors in Washington. This argument's been going on with. I just can't believe it. And then here on the pages of The Independent is that same assumption presented as part of a news account of the U.S. relationship with Ukraine. What you have to know, what you have to realize about the Obama administration in Ukraine is that the Obama administration practiced what's been called hybrid war against Ukraine, managed to arrange the overthrow of an elected president of this region, which is about as central to recent Russian history as California is to recent American history. The U.S. engineered a coup in Ukraine and established a government in Ukraine that rejected any association with Russia and included, for the first time since 1945, explicit Nazis in the government. That's what the Obama administration did. We put a government into Ukraine, an illegal government into Ukraine, after a coup that produced a regime with Nazis in it. This was the result of the hybrid war of the U.S. in regard to Ukraine. The outcome of that was a resistance by aspects of Ukraine to this American-denominated government, and that has led to a civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine that's killed 10,000 people. Most Americans have not heard of this, but there are 10,000 dead folks there who were not a result of anything but the Obama administration's machinations. At the same time, the population of Crimea voted not to be subject to this new fascist-infected government that the U.S. had put in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, and preferred the presence of the Russian military forces in Crimea. They'd been there all along in order to resist the Obama administration-denominated government. That's the situation in Ukraine, but you wouldn't know it from reading the American press. Now here, or press like The Independent. The Trump administration, they say, is considering blocking $250 million in military assistance to Ukraine in the latest move that highlights the White House's preference for Russia. In other words, this is being interpreted by The Independent as a move in favor of Russia because the U.S. is not spending money on or threatening not to spend money. They probably will eventually. Not a lot of money either.
No, not too much.
Big pardon?
$250 million.
Exactly.
It's
hard.
Chump change.
It's chump change. But the fact that the Trump administration...
Israel gets $4 billion.
That the Trump administration should consider not giving this chump change to Ukraine is considered a scandal. Donald Trump has asked his national security team to review the Ukraine Security Initiative, that's a plan, quote, in order to ensure the money is being used in the best interest of the United States, according to a report from Politico. What a terrible thing to do. Politicians have already allocated this money for security aid to Ukraine for the 2019 fiscal year, including funds for weapons, training, and intelligence support. Remember, this is the government that is killed thousands of people in the eastern part of Ukraine because they won't submit to this coup-backed government. Defense Secretary Mark Esper and National Security Advisor John Bolton are reportedly among the officials reviewing that funding. But members of both parties are upset with the delay that we're not giving the Koosters money right away, which comes after the president again downplayed Moscow's military intervention in Ukraine. Very interesting way to put it. At last weekend's G7 summit, blaming the situation there on former President Barack Obama. What an amazing thing to do. And the Independents think that's outrageous that that Trump should blame the situation there on Barack Obama. Once again, if you knew the facts, you would know that it was in fact the Barack Obama administration that put that government in place by coup in Kiev. He also asserted at the Summit of the World Leaders that Russia should be reinstated to the Group of Seven. Once again, a terrible indication that Trump is an agent of Moscow. Ukrainian troops, remember, this is news, not interpretation. Ukrainian troops have been fighting Russian-backed separatist military in the east of the country since 2014. Yeah, they did. They're trying to assert the authority of the fascist-infected government in the eastern part of the country, a conflict in which more than 10,000 people are thought to have been killed. And very little reported in this country, of course. In 2017, the Trump administration approved lethal arms sales to Ukraine. Of course they did. They were doing just what the Obama administration had done. The new review would scale back this support and be seen as an open allegiance to Russia, in international policy, stirring criticism at home. Not giving the money to the fascists would immediately be seen as open allegiance to Russia. You can't make this stuff up. Or, in fact, the Independent does make this stuff up, and so does a great deal of the rest of the mainstream media. Quote, "The bigger problem is that Trump is once again showing himself to be an asset to Russia." Representative Tom Malinowski, a Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, told Politico. Quote, "We are aware of an Office of Management and Budget hold on funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative," Evan Hollander, the House Appropriations Committee spokesman, said in a statement. "We have serious concerns about a freeze on these important appropriated funds, and we are urgently inquiring with the administration about why they are holding up these resources." Close quote. Representative Adam Schiff, have to be careful, the Democratic chairman of the House Intelligence Committee,
He always is.
also tweeted his opposition to the bloc, writing that, quote, "Trump is withholding vital military aid to Ukraine while his personal lawyer seeks help from the Ukraine government to investigate his political opponent." It takes too long to explain what he's saying there. It's nonsense. "It doesn't take a stable genius to see the magnitude of this conflict," the tweet continued, "or how destructive it is to our national security." It's destructive to our national security that we're not giving the fascists in Kiev immediately as much money as they wanted, and that we're thinking about whether we should do it or not. Now, this is quite amazing. And as I say, Russiagate is not over, and astonishingly enough, it's infected the British press as well as ours.
Jimmy Dore did a nice little program about the New York Times editorial board reaction. Apparently, they called this meeting, which the editor, the guy who does the opinions, a guy named Dean Baquet, Baquet, talked about the Russiagate thing and the mistakes that might have been made and so on and so forth. And I think Jimmy Dore, as he usually does, did a good satirical kind of takedown of the New York Times editorial policies in that regard. They're not really admitting that they've been onto a red herring all this time. They're just trying to kind of smooth it over and move on and make sure that any of their journalists who might have some doubts about it, about what's been going down there in relation to Russiagate, is still sort of in the fold and on the same page regarding the fact that there's a broader issue here. It just isn't Russiagate, it's being anti-Trump.
Yes, well, exactly. Or that one is being used for the other, the important part of the thing.
And of course, I am anti-Trump, but, I'm anti-Trump, but that doesn't mean I'm pro-Democrat or pro-New York Times.
But I suggested at the beginning of the hour that the Democratic Party, in order to be sure that its policies, neoliberal and neoconservative as they are, that is more war and more austerity, are carried on, are typically not stepping forward and saying, we want to be elected president because we want policies of more war and more austerity. That is in fact the case, but to say that would seem to have deleterious consequences perhaps with the American public. So what the Democrats do instead is scream, Trump is a racist and we've got to get him out of there. The reason they got to get him out of there from their point of view, from the point of view of the Democratic Party, is to make sure that those pro-war and pro-austerity policies are continued, and the fear that maybe they won't be continued in quite so clear a fashion under Trump. And there have been some indications since the 2016 campaign that Trump has offered criticisms of those policies. He hasn't acted on them. I mean, the policies of this administration in regard to war and austerity are essentially those of the last administration, but there always tends to be that peculiar, maybe we get from Trump. For example, the present discussion of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. The government structure as a whole, the deep state, if you like, but that's probably not necessary. All we need to talk about is the so-called permanent government, what the United States government as a whole does as a matter of policy. They're scared to death of the notion that Trump might, in fact, withdraw American troops from Afghanistan and are doing all they can to make sure that he won't be able to. Okay. Some things are not Trump's fault. And it's worthwhile talking about the U.S. government policy rather than the peculiar vagaries of Mr. Trump's outlook on the world.
Yeah, I wanted to make clear, because I think I might have started to say something and not finished saying it. The New York Times article about Stephen Miller did not mention that he's Jewish. Or that he has a background in Zionist Israel-related work. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm sure it's there. So I'm kind of astonished that this wouldn't be included, but it's a big tell regarding where the liberal elites are at now in relation to Trump's relationship with Israel, the Netanyahu government, and so forth. This is really something quite new in U.S. presidential politics. I'm sure that whoever, and as we're looking at the Democratic Party candidates, we're not seeing them say much of anything about their support or questions about Israel and Palestine, or about their support or concern about the manner in which the two congresspersons were treated or were not allowed to visit the West Bank, what is called Palestine, which is really occupied Palestine. So I just wanted to make that clear that this is a kind of fascinating aspect of these politics right now, and Jewish voters are a big deal. And sorry for the crass language, but Jewish money is a big deal in U.S. politics. Money given by Jews with general sympathies towards the Jewish state is a big deal in U.S. policies, and Trump is just playing politics. He's got Sheldon Adelson, and I'm sure that the Democrats will still have Chaim, what's his name, and Saban.
Saban, yes.
Saban. So we'll see how this plays out. Enough for now. Anyway.
So it's all about the Benjamins, baby.
Yeah, all about the Benjamins, but not in the way Ilhan Omar kind of clunkily said it. Politics is all about the Benjamins, but neoliberalism, financial capitalism, late capitalism is all about the. Capitalism has always been all about the Benjamins, which is why Marx had not only to write Capital Volume 1, he had to write Capital Volume 2 and 3 and torture the hell out of us with trying to read that damn thing. But if you listen to David Harvey, though, you can pretty much get it straightened out, I think.
We recommend that, too.
Yeah.
And for an updating in a certain way what it is of those issues, we continue to recommend Thomas Piketty's book,
Absolutely.
which is being dissed on all sides as too long and difficult to read.
Yeah, I think the more, and as long as we're talking about the 2020 election and the general global economic outlook, well, we weren't talking about that, but we are now. Let me just say, it's because I'm always cautious, as the economists whom I respect are cautious about predicting the next recession. And even the one blogger, the Marxist blogger, the very excellent Marxist blogger Michael Roberts, the British Marxist economist, he labels his blog, or he titles his blog, the next recession, but he doesn't necessarily want to predict one without really feeling like he's got his ducks lined up, and he feels like he's got them lined up pretty well now in terms of the global economic downturn. Now, he's a pretty strict Marxist, meaning he's a pretty strict falling rate of profit, what they call a FROP Marxist. He accords an enormous amount of value to this one thing, about one characteristic which capitalism has, which is to have a falling rate of profit once a certain industry really gets going. And he's seeing a global economic downturn in the making in the next months or year or two. But even a cautious sort of Keynesian economist who more or less doesn't deal with FROP so much, but deals with just what the indicators are on a sort of daily, within the past year, month-over-month basis. Someone like Dean Baker, who I often refer to, he's all of a sudden, or not maybe all of a sudden, but he's gradually seems to be getting won over to the idea that the global economy isn't doing very well. China is not going to be buying our, for complicated reasons, including the trade war and all that. China is not going to be helping us out quite the way they have been. Trump's economic policies are just crazy in this kind of context, but they're still capitalist, and capitalism is still, of course, regularly subject to these downturns, these recessions, not necessarily a result of financial crashes. It doesn't have to be 2008. There doesn't have to be a kind of bubble that bursts. It's just the way capitalism is, and all this should be understood in the context of what's going to happen with Trump and his Fed board of governors, or the Federal Reserve Board, over the next year, all the politics around that. But it's quite possible that that's going to work against Trump and in the Democratic Party's favor in the next year, unless Trump could really do something to sort of mute this trend.
I was interested in recalling that years ago, someone had praised to me an economic indicator that I was told had predicted 7 of the last 5 recessions. And I think we have another such prediction perhaps before us now. Now, which group this prediction belongs to is still to be seen. But the general question of the American economy is, we admit, bound up with the world economy in all sorts of ways. It is not an independent and isolated circumstance, and therefore paying some attention to it is the beginning of wisdom. I do think that we sometimes ignore American policy at large and speak of the economy as if it were an independent variable, that it didn't have anything to do with what the U.S. government chooses to do. And that, of course, is, on the face of it, obviously not true. But the reflection on the sort of political sources of economic transformations in the world in recent years came home to me as I was thinking about the peculiar example of the grand old men of American foreign policy. I'm thinking here particularly of Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. One's dead, the other isn't. It's a little hard to tell which one occasionally. But the fact of the matter is that a decade or more ago, we had a peculiar conjunction of these jealous and self-regarding figures on what the long-term policy of the United States should be in regard to economics and politics. They saw, and these were not stupid men. I mean, they're not making this stuff up as they go along. They're making this stuff up all the time. But in any case,
Yeah. But they're very consistent in their
Exactly.
strategic plan regarding American global power.
That's right.
And how to maintain that.
And a decade ago, both of them would agree that the overwhelming question facing the United States government in world economics and politics was the question of the economic integration of Eurasia. That the real threat to American economic the economic dominance of the world that the U.S. won, in some sense, at the end of the Second World War, that had been the case, indeed, ever since then. The real threat to it today, they would have said 10 years ago, was a conjunction of Russia and China and a economic organization of Eurasia that would exclude the United States, or at least limit the United States' ability to exploit most of the world, the Eurasian landmass. That was what had to be stopped. That's what the U.S. was really interested in. And indeed, you can talk about American foreign policy since the Second World War, and indeed, perhaps in many ways, long before that, as an attempt to make sure that that economic integration of Eurasia didn't take place. Well, 10 years ago, as you looked at that, the threat of that economic integration came precisely from an alliance of Russia and China. And what had to be done by the United States, according to B&K, what had to be done was splitting up that alliance. And both of these gurus told American planners that they should choose one and diss the other. Break up the alliance of Russia and China by favoring Russia and opposing China, or, if you would rather, favor China and oppose Russia. Well, the interesting thing is, I think that the American the American foreign policy establishment agreed entirely with the analysis and split on which choice they made. Some preferred China and therefore were horrified at the appearance of Russia. The others said, no, we need an alliance with Russia and an ongoing and thoroughgoing attack on China. What we're seeing in the Trump administration is the result, in some sense, of that argument, where the anti-Chinese group are accusing the anti-Chinese group are praising the approaches to Russia because it disses China, and the other group praising approaches to China because it disses Russia. Have I got that backwards now?
No, I think you got it. Good.
I'm not sure that that's not a good way to begin talking about what's going on right now, and the reason that the anti-China forces are suggesting that, the anti-Russia forces are suggesting that Trump is an agent of Russia because of the division in this approach to foreign policy. The interesting thing is that they're not aligned on this, that there are elements of both in the American government right now, and American policy is confused by the fact that they don't know who they love and who they hate.
Yeah. It's a complicated business, and even on the left, or what we call the left, it's interesting to note, just perhaps briefly, because I haven't done all that much research into Hong Kong, and I wouldn't know how to be honest with you. Wouldn't know where to go to really understand that problem. But in terms of sampling the left media regarding the demonstrations and protests that are going on in Hong Kong right now, I would at least refer to two interviews I've listened to. There's actually the moderate rebels, Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal, have done an hour-long or so interview with one of their sources, one of their allies, I think, as they would say. I mean, they pick their guests carefully to support the idea that U.S. foreign policy is always a problem, that whatever's mostly what's going on in the world is U.S. foreign policy pursuing ends that that are not to the benefit of the actual real people of this country. They are going to do they actually did a 2-hour interview. From what I can tell what they said, the second hour hasn't been put up yet, but that can be listened to or watched actually on YouTube, or listened to as a podcast under Moderate Rebels. And their view is that they name a lot of names, as do the articles that have appeared on Consortium News and so forth. They name the names of these wealthy people, this Danny Lay and so forth, this media mogul, who they feel are mostly behind what the protests are in Hong Kong, whatever the genuine dissatisfactions are with the people there. They see it as something going on that's being provoked by people, by wealthy and powerful people with a political agenda vis-a-vis the mainland. Okay, that's Moderate Rebels. In contrast to that, Doug Henwood did a kind of a strange interview. He does just 25-minute programs, or 25-minute interviews, half a program with his informant, and his informant talked really fast, had to listen really fast, and I don't know if I've ever heard of anybody get more words into 25 minutes than this fellow did. But what was interesting about it, and pretty much from the perspective of this is a genuine protest, there's genuine dissatisfaction. What was kind of fascinating, and I might go back and listen to this to make sure, he didn't mention one name of a person in discussing what the protests are about. He didn't mention one. I mean, all these people that are being thrown, all these names are being thrown about in terms of who's behind the Hong Kong protests and what that Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton are pointing to. There wasn't a name of a person mentioned in this 25-minute interview that Doug Henwood did with this fellow just this past week. So and the point is that this is a general mass uprising of some kind, and I'm sure it is. And so the question is the question we want to ask: who's behind it, and whose interests are going to be ultimately served by this, or is the question going to be how are the interests of the people of Hong Kong, who are certainly in a bad way, how are they going to be served by this?
It would be very interesting to hear the answers to those questions. Who are these people, and what are they after, and what's going on here? We're not going to get it apparently from the American media at all. And once again, it plays into this these fantasies about Russia and China that are being constructed by American political, the American foreign policy establishment in order to justify the opposition that would defend American, or rather the American 1%'s economic hegemony. This is the real goal of American policy, and I must say also of American reporting on these matters, to make the American public understand that what's in the interest of America, which is translated as what's in the interest of the American 1%.
Yeah.
That's the story we've got to tell.
I mean, what you miss out on is whatever general. I mean, Hong Kong is in a bad way because they used to be a big part of China's economy, and now they're much less. They used to be a manufacturing center, now they're just a finance center. And that makes, like whether it's New York City or San Francisco, that's hard on most of the people who actually live there, including just finding a place to live. But the mainstream media, haven't read carefully the New York Times articles about this, but they put it in terms of freedom. They put it in terms of them versus the Chinese government. This whole business about the sort of extradition treaty, that was kind of a red herring that supposedly got the whole thing started. They didn't even, I don't think the mainstream media even got that right. It wasn't about it wasn't about this murderer, this, I guess, alleged murderer, but people pretty much think that this guy killed his girlfriend. It wasn't about him being extradited from Hong Kong to China, to mainland China. It was about him being extradited from Hong Kong to Taiwan. So it's just crazy confusing about what's going on here. But the mainstream media, they don't care about what the structural economic condition is in Hong Kong. They just care about sort of they want freedom because Chinese are communists,
yes,
kind of thing.
Very good. You can't tell the players without a program, and of course the United States media are very much interested in making sure that you don't get a program.
Yeah. So I just said more on the basis of less actually understanding. I mean, I'm not comfortable talking about this because I haven't researched it, but this is just sort of, I would call these superficial impressions, but fitting into the pattern that we usually talk about on these programs, including the pattern of how the left is dealing with these issues. Because, as we know, people like Max Blumenthal and Ben Norden have their severe critics on the so-called Marxist left.
When one of the points we've made frequently in the past is Noam Chomsky's observation that if you want to as good account as you can get of what's going on in the world at large, don't read the political press, read the business press. It's more important for people who actually are dealing with business one way or another to know what the facts are rather than what the ideological cover is. So the Wall Street Journal is more likely to tell you the truth than the New York Times. I think there's, as a general rule, that's not far that's not far wrong. I do say that you find some peculiar things in the business press. I have in mind particularly the publication Business Insider, which I rather like, in part because it is an outside witness to the sorts of things the business press does. Business Insider, begun as an American publication, is owned by the Axel Springer Group in Germany now, although most of its writers are Americans. And last week they carried an article entitled U.S. Spies, interesting source, U.S. spies say Trump's G7 performance suggests he's either a Russian asset or a useful idiot for Putin. This is the business press. Now, what we have here is Russiagate, Rita Vivis, and the international foreign policy notions of the opposition to the Russian-Chinese alliance. The article, the Business Insider article, reads, current and former spies, again an interesting source, are floored by President Donald Trump's fervent defense of Russia at this year's G7 summit in Biarritz, France. Quote, it's hard to see the bar anymore since it's been pushed so far down the last few years, but President Trump's behavior over the weekend was a new low. One FBI agent who works in counterintelligence told Insider. Now, this is interesting on several levels, including an FBI man leaking analyses of the president's behavior to the foreign business press, to the business press, and an account that at least is tendentious. At the summit, Trump aggressively lobbied for Russia to be readmitted into the G7, refused to hold it accountable for violating international law.
Okay.
We'd never do that. Blamed former President Barack Obama for Russia's annexation of Crimea, quite appropriate, and expressed sympathy for Russian President Vladimir Putin. One former senior Justice Department official who worked closely with the former special counsel Robert Mueller when he was the FBI director told Insider, Business Insider, this publication, Trump's behavior was, quote, directly out of the Putin playbook. We have a Russian asset sitting in the Oval Office, close quote. Now, wonderful conjunction here between the Russiagate nonsense and the foreign policy establishment trying to work out the Russia-Chinese nexus. If it were reported straight, it might make some sense. But reported as we have it, it's not at all surprising that very few Americans have a sense of what's going on here.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. If you wanted to make any concluding comments, or I did, I'm not sure if I have any.
I will repeat this.
We'll save. I'll save you Alan Dershowitz and Jeffrey Epstein for next week.
Oh, that's probably good for our soul, right?
Yeah.
I'll add you a little more of the Russia-Chinese business if you want.
Sure.
A former CIA operative, notes again the sources of this, of this news account. A former CIA operative told Business Insider the evidence is overwhelming that Trump is a Russian agent. But another CIA and NSA veteran said it was more likely Trump was currying favor with Putin for future business deals. He's not a Russian agent now, he's going to be a Russian agent in the future. Or maybe, as the CIA wants to put it about, he's actually a Russian spy at the moment. Meanwhile, a recently retired FBI special agent, hey, look, all these people are in it together. A recently retired FBI special agent told Business Insiders that Trump's freewheeling and often unfounded statements make it more likely he's a useful idiot for the Russians. But, quote, it would not surprise me in the least if the Russians had at least one asset in Trump's inner circle. And this Business Insider, which is the source of this intelligence, advises us to consult other articles in their publication for the account of the difficult question, is Trump a conscious or an unconscious agent of a foreign power?
Maybe this has something to do with the fact that Jeffrey Epstein is no longer with us. Sorry.
Wheels within wheels. This is remarkable on so many levels, it seems to me, both journalistic and governmental, and even more important for the spy agency, the American spy agencies. What people are finally perhaps justified in calling the deep state, that it's hard to know how you begin to correct the account of world politics and economy that the majority of Americans get. If you drink this swill all the time, you don't notice what you need in terms of nourishment, and I'm afraid that's what's happened.
If you're watching this on Friday, which is August 30th, have a nice Labor Day weekend. If you're not watching it, if you're watching it later, I hope you had a nice Labor Day weekend.
Good. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 35th week of 2019, a What the 2020 Election is About edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Kevin Lau. See research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson, who's won this phase of the argument, but it's not over. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune.
We're going to get you, Jeff.
We'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and mine is charge. In the meanwhile, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.